The spring of 1873 arrived with a fury of wildflowers that painted the Wyoming territory in splashes of purple and gold. But Lillian Foster cared little for the beauty blooming around her. Standing at the edge of the Snake River, her cream-colored dress billowing in the breeze, she scanned the distant horizon for the silhouette she had waited all winter to see. This marked the third spring she had come to this exact spot, waiting with diminishing hope for a man who might never return. Lillian tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, squinting against the setting sun that transformed the river's surface into molten gold. At 22, she had already known more heartache than most women twice her age. The small town of Riverton whispered about that Foster girl who refused every suitor's advances in favor of waiting by the river for a cowboy who had likely forgotten her name. "You'll catch your death out here," came her father's voice from behind her. Lillian didn't turn. "Just a bit longer, Pa," Harold Foster sighed, the sound as weary as the lines etched into his weathered face. "He ain't coming back, Lily." "It's been 3 years since. 2 years and 8 months, she corrected softly, her eyes never leaving the bend in the river where the terrain opened to the vast plains beyond. "And he promised." Her father's boots crunched on the riverbank as he approached, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The railroad's coming through, towns changing. Maybe it's time you did too." But Lillian knew what he truly meant, that it was time she accepted one of the town merchant's proposals or resigned herself to spinsterhood. At her age, most women had been married for years with at least one child on their hip. "Just until sunset," she whispered. "Please." Her father's hand fell away. "Supper'll be waiting." His footsteps faded behind her, leaving her alone with the rushing water and her memories. Memories of a man with eyes the color of a summer storm, who had ridden into town 3 springs ago with nothing but his horse, his reputation, and stories that made the air around him crackle with adventure. Kirk Gallagher had been unlike any man Riverton had ever seen, dangerous, rumored to be a former outlaw seeking redemption, yet gentle when he spoke to her during those stolen moments at the general store where she worked. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water. Lillian hugged herself against the evening chill, remembering the last time she had seen him on this very spot. "I'll come back for you," he had promised, his voice rough with emotion as he held her hands in his. "When I've made something of myself, when I've become a man worthy of you. Wait for me by the river. Each spring, when the snow melts and the wildflowers bloom, I'll find my way back to you." She had believed him with every fiber of her being. The first spring, she had come to the river daily, wearing her best dress, heart leaping at every distant sound. By the second spring, the visits had become weekly, her hope dimming like a lantern running out of oil. Now, in this third spring, even Lillian had to admit that perhaps her father was right. Perhaps Kirk Gallagher had simply been another drifter with pretty words, or worse, perhaps he lay in an unmarked grave somewhere in the vast, unforgiving west. The sun touched the distant mountains, painting them in fiery hues. Lillian sighed, turning to leave when a flicker of movement caught her eye. She froze, heart hammering against her ribs as she strained to see through the gathering dusk. There, where the trail curved alongside the river, a lone rider appeared. The silhouette of man and horse moved steadily toward her, backlit by the dying sun. Lillian's breath caught in her throat as she took an unconscious step forward, the pebbles at the river's edge shifting beneath her boots. The rider drew closer, and she could make out the broad shoulders, the straight back, the familiar way he sat in the saddle. His horse, a powerful chestnut stallion, picked its way carefully down the slope toward the river crossing. Lillian stood paralyzed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that if she blinked, the apparition would vanish like morning mist. The rider stopped at the river's edge, perhaps 20 yards from where she stood. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that she felt rather than heard. He took off his hat, revealing hair the color of dark wheat touched by the sun, now longer than she remembered. Even in the fading light, she could see the changes in him, his face more weathered, his frame hardened by years of work and wandering. But those eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams, remained unchanged. "Lillian," he said, her name carried to her on the evening breeze. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. "Kirk!" They moved toward each other, slowly at first, then with gathering speed until they met at the river's edge, stopping just short of touching. Up close, she could see the scar that hadn't been there before, cutting across his left cheekbone. His clothes were finer than the worn denim and faded cotton he'd worn when he left, but his eyes held the same intensity that had captured her heart years ago. "You're here," she whispered, scarcely believing the evidence of her own eyes. "You came back." Kirk Gallagher's weather-beaten face softened into the smile she had remembered during countless lonely nights. "I told you I would." His voice was deeper, richer than in her memories. "I've ridden 1,000 miles to get back to this spot." "I waited," Lillian said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "Each spring, just as you asked." Kirk reached out slowly, as if she might dissolve under his touch, and brushed his fingertips against her cheek. "And I've waited too," he said softly. "Every day away from you felt like an eternity." The tears spilled over then, tracking silver paths down Lillian's cheeks. "3 springs, Kirk, where have you been?" His hand fell away, and something flickered in those storm-gray eyes: pain, regret, secrets still untold. "Making myself into a man who deserves you," he answered. "And that's a story that'll take more than one sunset to tell." As if reminded of the fading light, he glanced at the darkening sky. "Your father will be worried. He's given up on you," she admitted. "The whole town has." A rueful smile curved his lips. "Can't say I blame them, but you didn't." "No," she whispered. "I didn't." Kirk took her hand in his, the calluses on his palm rough against her skin. "Will you hear me out, Lillian? Will you let me tell you why it took so long, where I've been, what I've done to come back to you?" Lillian looked at their joined hands, then up into the face of the man she had waited for through 3 lonely springs. The smart choice would be to send him away, to protect her heart from the pain he might inflict again. But Lillian Foster had never been accused of making the smart choice when it came to Kirk Gallagher. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll listen." Relief washed over his features. "Not tonight. I've got a camp set up just beyond that ridge. Tomorrow I'll come to town proper, do things right this time." He squeezed her hand gently. "If you'll still have me after you hear everything." "Tomorrow then," she agreed, reluctant to let go of his hand, afraid he might disappear again. As if reading her thoughts, Kirk stepped closer, his free hand coming up to tilt her chin. "I'm not vanishing again, Lily. I swear it on my life." The nickname, one only he had ever used, broke something loose inside her. "You'd better not," she whispered fiercely. "Or I'll track you down myself this time." His laugh was warm and genuine, wrapping around her like a blanket against the evening chill. "I believe you would at that." He sobered, his gaze intense. "I've changed, Lily. Seen things, done things. But one thing's remained the same: how I feel about you." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss as gentle as a whisper, yet it sent heat coursing through her veins. When he pulled back, his eyes had darkened to the color of thunderclouds. "Tomorrow," he promised again. "I'll come to your father's house at noon," Lillian nodded, unable to find her voice. Kirk reluctantly released her hand, stepping back to his horse. With practiced ease, he swung into the saddle, settling his hat back on his head. "Sleep well, Lillian Foster," he said, his voice a caress in the gathering darkness. "You as well, Kirk Gallagher," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She watched as he turned his horse, riding back the way he had come, his silhouette growing fainter against the darkening sky until he disappeared around the bend in the river. Only then did Lillian allow herself to collapse onto a nearby boulder, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. He had returned, just as he promised. Tomorrow would bring explanations, perhaps heartache, perhaps joy. But tonight, for the first time in nearly 3 years, Lillian Foster would sleep with hope blooming in her heart like the wildflowers that carpeted the Wyoming spring. The walk back to town seemed both longer and shorter than usual. Lillian's mind raced ahead to tomorrow, while her feet moved mechanically along the familiar path. The lights of Riverton came into view, a scattered collection of buildings that had grown considerably since Kirk had left. The railroad survey team had come through last autumn, and already speculators and new businesses were establishing themselves in anticipation of the Iron Horse's arrival. Her father's house sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest 2-story structure that had seen better days but still stood proud against the elements. Light glowed from the windows, a beacon guiding her home. Lillian paused at the gate, gathering her composure before facing her father's inevitable questions. Harold Foster sat at the kitchen table, his Bible open before him, though his eyes weren't on the sacred text. Instead, he watched the door, relief washing over his features when Lillian stepped inside. "Was beginning to think I'd have to come looking for you," he said, closing the Bible gently. "Supper's gone cold. I'm not hungry, Pa." Lillian hung her shawl on the peg by the door, aware of her father's scrutinizing gaze. "You've been crying." It wasn't a question. Lillian touched her cheek, surprised to find it still damp. He came back. Her father stared at her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Gallagher." She nodded, moving to the stove where the coffee pot still steamed. She poured 2 cups, bringing one to her father. "He's coming here tomorrow." "At noon." Harold accepted the cup but didn't drink. "What does he want after all this time?" "To explain," Lillian said, sitting across from him. "To tell me where he's been, why it took so long. And you believe he has a good reason?" Her father's voice held no judgment, only concern. Lillian stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise in curling tendrils. "I don't know, but I need to hear him out." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "You know I only want your happiness, Lily, always have, but that man. He left you waiting for years with nothing but a promise on the wind." "He came back, Pa," she said softly. "That has to count for something." Harold nodded slowly. "I suppose it does. And I reckon I owe him the courtesy of listening before I form any judgment." Lillian reached across the table, covering her father's weathered hand with her own. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he warned, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Still might take my shotgun to him if his reasons don't measure up." Lillian laughed, the sound startling in the quiet kitchen. "Fair enough." That night, sleep proved elusive. Lillian lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the brief encounter by the river. Kirk had changed not just physically, but something in his eyes, something deeper. The boy who had ridden away had returned a man, carrying burdens she could only guess at. Yet when he looked at her, when he spoke her name, she had seen the same tenderness, the same longing that had captured her heart 3 years ago. Morning came with agonizing slowness. Lillian rose early, attacking her chores with unusual vigor, desperate for distraction. She swept the floors, kneaded bread dough with enough force to make her father raise an eyebrow, and changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue calico that Kirk had once complimented. As noon approached, her father settled in his chair on the porch, pipe in hand, his expression carefully neutral. Lillian busied herself in the kitchen, though she had prepared enough food for 10 people rather than 3. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain her father must hear it from the porch. She smoothed her hands over her skirt, checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door, and took a deep breath before stepping outside. Kirk Gallagher rode toward the house at an unhurried pace, sitting tall in the saddle. He had exchanged his travel-worn clothes for a clean white shirt under a black vest, dark trousers tucked into polished boots. His dark blonde hair was neatly trimmed, the stubble from yesterday shaved clean. Only the scar on his cheek remained as evidence of the hardships he might have endured. He stopped at the gate, dismounting with the same fluid grace she remembered. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully as he approached the porch where Harold Foster remained seated, pipe smoke curling around his head like a protective halo. "Mr. Foster," Kirk said, his deep voice carrying easily in the still noon air. "It's good to see you again, sir." Harold nodded once. "Gallagher, been a long time." "Yes, sir, it has." Kirk's eyes moved to Lillian, standing in the doorway, and something in his expression softened. "Miss Foster." "Mr. Gallagher," she replied, the formality feeling strange after their reunion the previous evening. Harold gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Suppose you'd better sit down and tell us where you've been all this time." Kirk hesitated, then mounted the steps and took the offered seat, placing his hat on his knee. "Thank you, sir." Lillian moved to the porch railing, unwilling to miss a word. The tension in the air was palpable as Kirk gathered his thoughts. "I owe you both an explanation," he began, his voice steady though his fingers betrayed his nervousness, turning his hat brim slowly. "When I left here, I had nothing to my name but my horse and gun. No prospects, no future to offer anyone, especially your daughter." Harold puffed on his pipe. "You weren't the first young man with empty pockets, Gallagher." "No, sir, but I had something worse than empty pockets." Kirk's eyes met Lillian's briefly before returning to her father. "I had a past that was following me." Lillian's breath caught. The rumors that had swirled around Kirk when he first arrived in Riverton that he was running from the law, that he had ridden with outlaws, had never concerned her. But now, seeing the gravity in his expression, she wondered if perhaps there had been more truth to them than she had wanted to believe. "When I was 16, Kirk continued, "my father died, leaving my mother and sisters with nothing but debts. I fell in with a bad crowd, the Tyler gang. Maybe you've heard of them." Harold's expression darkened. "Bank robbers and horse thieves." Kirk nodded, shame evident in the set of his shoulders. "I never pulled a trigger on anyone, but I helped them, rode with them for 2 years before I realized what I was becoming." He took a deep breath. "I left them, tried to make an honest life. That's when I drifted here to Riverton." Lillian remembered the wary young man who had taken odd jobs around town, keeping to himself until the day he had stepped into the general store where she worked, asking for supplies with a politeness that belied his rough appearance. "Meeting your daughter changed everything for me," Kirk said, his eyes finding Lillian's again. "But I knew I couldn't build a life with her while my past remained unsettled. The gang had been captured, but I was still wanted for questioning, still had my name on wanted posters in 2 territories." "So you left to clear your name," Lillian said softly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Kirk nodded. "I turned myself in to a federal marshal in Cheyenne, told him everything I knew about the gang, about their hideouts, their methods. In exchange, he agreed to help clear my name if I helped him track down the last 2 members who were still at large." Harold set his pipe down. "You became a bounty hunter?" "Not exactly, more like an informant." Kirk's voice tightened. "It was dangerous work, took longer than I expected. Had to travel to Colorado, New Mexico, even down to Texas. Every time I thought it was over, the marshal would find another lead, another loose end to tie up." "You could have written," Lillian said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "A letter, anything to let me know you were alive." Kirk's expression was pained. "I wanted to. God knows I wanted to, but the marshal warned me against it. Said if anyone from the old gang found out I was helping the law, they might seek revenge against those I cared about." His eyes held hers. "I couldn't risk putting you in danger, Lily. It was hard enough knowing I was the reason you were waiting, without fearing you might be hurt because of me." Harold studied the younger man for a long moment. "And now, is it finished?" "Yes, sir. Last member of the gang was captured 6 months ago in Santa Fe. I stayed on to testify at the trial, then worked my way back north." Kirk set his hat aside, leaning forward earnestly. "I have papers from the federal marshal clearing my name, and I've saved every penny I earned. Bought land, about 10 miles west of here, good grazing land with a creek running through it. Started building a house. Lillian's heart leapt at this revelation. "You've been here for months." Kirk shook his head. "Just 3 weeks. Wanted to have something to show for myself before I came to you. Wanted to be able to offer you more than promises this time." He glanced at Harold. "But I couldn't wait until the house was finished. Not when spring came and I knew you might be waiting by the river." A moment of silence fell over the porch as father and daughter absorbed Kirk's story. Harold finally reached for his pipe again, relighting it thoughtfully. "Sounds like you've been through a fair amount, Gallagher," he said at last. "Can't say I approve of your methods, leaving my daughter to wonder for years, but I understand your reasons." He gave Kirk a hard look. "What are your intentions now?" Kirk straightened in his chair, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "With your blessing, Mr. Foster, I'd like to court your daughter properly. And when the house is finished, if she'll have me, I want to make her my wife." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Despite their reunion by the river, despite the kiss they had shared, she hadn't dared hope for such a direct declaration. Harold glanced at his daughter, noting the color that had risen to her cheeks, the hope shining in her eyes. He sighed deeply, then nodded once. "Reckon that decision isn't mine to make," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Lily's a grown woman, old enough to know her own mind." Kirk's gaze shifted to Lillian, his storm-gray eyes filled with a question he seemed afraid to voice. Lillian stepped forward, her heart thundering in her chest. "I would like to see this land of yours, Mr. Gallagher, and this house you're building." A slow smile spread across Kirk's face, transforming his serious features. "I'd be honored to show you, Miss Foster." "Perhaps tomorrow, if your father approves." Harold waved a hand, a hint of amusement breaking through his stern demeanor. "Go on then, but have her back before dark and mind your manners." "Yes, sir," Kirk said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, sir." Lillian couldn't contain her smile any longer. "Would you stay for dinner, Kirk? I've prepared more than enough." "I'd be delighted," he answered, his eyes never leaving hers. As they moved inside, Lillian felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of waiting, of uncertainty, had lifted from her shoulders. Kirk had returned, not as the penniless drifter who had left, but as a man who had faced his past and built a future he wanted to share with her. That evening, as Kirk prepared to leave, they stood together on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that reminded Lillian of their reunion by the river. "Thank you for listening," Kirk said softly, his hat in his hands, "for giving me a chance to explain." "Thank you for coming back," she replied, "even if it took 3 springs." A shadow crossed his face. "I wanted to come back sooner. Every day away from you felt like torture." Lillian reached out, touching the scar on his cheek gently. "How did you get this?" Kirk covered her hand with his, keeping it against his face. "Knife fight in a saloon in Denver. One of the gang members recognized me, figured out I was working with the law." Lillian shuddered at how close she had come to losing him without ever knowing. "I'm glad you survived." "Had something worth surviving for," he murmured, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. Heat bloomed in Lillian's chest at the gesture. "Tomorrow," she said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand, "you'll show me this land of yours, and the house, such as it is." Kirk smiled ruefully. "It's not much yet, just walls and a roof, but it will be, Lily. I promise you that." "I believe you," she said, and realized she truly did. Despite the years of waiting, despite the uncertainty and heartache, she believed in Kirk Gallagher and the future he offered. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek, mindful of her father's presence inside. "Until tomorrow, Lily." She watched him ride away, his figure silhouetted against the sunset much as it had been the previous evening. But this time, there was no ache in her heart, no fear that he wouldn't return. This time, Lillian Foster watched Kirk Gallagher leave with the certainty that he would come back tomorrow and all the days after. True to his word, Kirk arrived at the Foster home shortly after breakfast the next morning, riding his chestnut stallion and leading a gentle-looking bay mare. Lillian had been ready for an hour, dressed in her riding skirt and a practical blouse, her hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the spring sun. "Good morning," Kirk called, dismounting as Lillian emerged from the house. "Thought you might prefer to ride rather than take the wagon. It's quite a distance." Lillian approached the bay mare, stroking her velvety nose. "She's beautiful." "Her name's Daisy," Kirk said, watching Lillian with evident pleasure. "Gentlest horse I could find, bought her especially for." "Well for you." Lillian looked up in surprise. "For me," Kirk's cheeks colored slightly beneath his tan. "If things work out as I hope, you'll need a good horse out at the ranch, and even if they don't." He shrugged. "She's yours regardless." Touched beyond words, Lillian could only shake her head. "You're full of surprises, Kirk Gallagher." "Planning to keep it that way," he replied with a grin, helping her mount. They rode west out of town, following the old trading trail, before turning onto a less traveled path that wound through rolling hills covered in spring grass. As they rode, Kirk pointed out landmarks, naming creeks and distant mountains, his knowledge of the territory impressive for someone who had been gone so long. "How did you find this land?" Lillian asked as they crested a rise that afforded a view of the countryside spread before them. "Remembered it from before," Kirk answered. "Rode through here once, thought it was the prettiest piece of Wyoming I'd ever seen." He glanced at her. "Course, that was before I met you," Lillian laughed, the sound carrying on the breeze. "Smooth talker." "Honest talker," he corrected with a smile. They continued riding for another hour, the terrain gradually changing as they moved into an area where the hills gave way to a broad valley, split by a creek that gleamed silver in the sunlight. Kirk slowed his horse, pointing ahead. "There it is." Lillian followed his gaze to where a structure stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a partially constructed house, solid-looking, built of timber and local stone, with a pitched roof and a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. "It's not finished," Kirk said, suddenly sounding nervous. "Still needs windows, proper doors, and the inside is barely started," but Lillian hardly heard him. She was too busy taking in the setting, the creek flowing nearby, the mountains rising in the distance. The open land around that seemed to stretch forever. It was wild and beautiful and perfect. They dismounted near the house, tying the horses to a hitching post that had recently been set in the ground. Kirk led her up the steps to the porch, his hand gently supporting her elbow. "The floor's just been laid," he explained as they stepped inside. "Watch your step." The interior was indeed unfinished, but Lillian could see the bones of what would become a comfortable home. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough to warm the entire space during Wyoming's brutal winters. Rough-cut windows allowed light to stream in, illuminating the open main room. "Kitchen will be through there," Kirk said, pointing to an area where the framework of interior walls had been erected. "2 bedrooms on this side. Thought maybe someday we might add more if—" He trailed off, looking suddenly embarrassed. "If we need them," Lillian finished softly, understanding his meaning. "For children." "They're children," Kirk cleared his throat. "Yes, if we need them." Lillian moved to one of the window openings, gazing out at the land that stretched beyond. "It's beautiful, Kirk, all of it." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without touching. "I know it's not much yet, not compared to what you deserve." She turned to face him, struck by the uncertainty in his expression. This man who had faced outlaws and lawmen, who had ridden thousands of miles and built this house with his own hands, stood before her now looking as vulnerable as a boy. "It's everything," she said firmly. "It's perfect." Relief washed over his features. "Really, really." She reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. "Show me the rest." They spent the day exploring the property, Kirk pointing out the boundaries of his land, showing her the best fishing spots along the creek, the meadow where he planned to plant hay, the corral he had started building for the horses. Throughout it all, he spoke of the future, their future, with such conviction that Lillian found herself believing in it completely. They stopped for lunch beneath the cottonwood trees. Sharing the food Lillian had packed that morning. Sitting on a blanket Kirk had brought from his saddlebag, they talked easily, filling in the gaps of their years apart. "Tell me about the trial," Lillian said, watching as Kirk skipped a stone across the creek's surface. "Was it difficult, testifying against men you once rode with?" Kirk's expression grew serious. "Yes and no, these weren't good men, Lily. They hurt people, killed some, but still." He sighed. "There's a code among those who ride together. Breaking it didn't sit well, even if it was the right thing to do. Were you afraid?" "Not of them," he said, selecting another stone. "More afraid of not being able to come back to you, of failing." Lillian touched his arm gently. "You didn't fail, you're here." He covered her hand with his calloused palm warm against her skin. "There were times I thought I'd never make it back, times when I was sure you'd have given up on me." His gray eyes searched hers. "Why didn't you, Lily? 3 years is a long time to wait on nothing but a promise." Lillian considered the question, one she had asked herself countless times during those long, lonely years. "Because I knew you," she said finally. "Knew you wouldn't have made that promise lightly, and because what I felt for you, what I still feel, wasn't something I could just set aside and forget." Kirk's expression softened, his eyes darkening with emotion. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike the brief kiss they had shared by the river, this one lingered, deepening as Lillian responded, her hand moving to his shoulder for balance. When they finally separated, both were breathing faster, hearts racing with more than the spring heat. Kirk rested his forehead against hers, his voice a rough whisper. "I love you, Lillian Foster. Have since the moment you smiled at me in that general store. Everything I've done, everywhere I've been, it's all been to get back to you." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "I love you too." "Never stopped, not even when everyone told me I should." Kirk pulled back slightly, his expression serious. "I know 3 years is a long time, and I've no right to ask you to rush into anything. If you need time," Lillian placed her fingers gently over his lips, stopping his words. "I've had 3 years of time, Kirk Gallagher. I don't need any more." Joy spread across his features, transforming them. "Does that mean?" "It means yes," she said simply. "Whenever you're ready to ask properly, my answer will be yes." Kirk laughed, the sound echoing across the valley, startling a pair of rabbits from the nearby brush. In one fluid movement, he was on his feet, pulling Lillian up and spinning her in a circle that made her dizzy with more than just the motion. When he set her down, his expression had grown serious again, though his eyes still danced with happiness. "I want to do this right, Lily. Ask your father's permission, give you a proper courtship." "We've already had our courtship," she pointed out, breathless from the spinning and from the intensity of his gaze. 3 years of it, just with a considerable distance between us." Kirk chuckled, tucking a strand of hair that had escaped her braid behind her ear. "Still. I want to give you the kind of courtship other girls get: dinners, dances, walks in town where everyone can see us together." Lillian smiled, touched by his determination. "All right then, Mr. Gallagher, court me properly, but don't take too long about it. I've waited long enough for you already." His answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Yes, madam." The ride back to town that afternoon was filled with plans and possibilities. Kirk spoke of finishing the house by midsummer, of the cattle he planned to purchase, of his hopes to establish a breeding program for quality horses. Lillian listened, offering suggestions, imagining herself as part of this future he described so vividly. As they approached the outskirts of Riverton, Kirk grew quieter, his expression thoughtful. "Your father might not be so quick to give his blessing," he said finally. "He has every reason to distrust me after how long I've been gone. He'll come around," Lillian assured him. "He wants my happiness above all else." "And I make you happy?" Kirk asked, vulnerability flickering across his features again. Lillian reined her horse to a stop, waiting until Kirk did the same. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said softly. "Even when you were gone, the memory of you made me happier than any suitor who came calling." The tension eased from Kirk's shoulders. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that, Lily. I swear it. They continued into town, aware of the curious glances from townspeople who recognized the prodigal cowboy riding beside Lillian Foster. By the time they reached her father's house, word of their day together had no doubt spread throughout Riverton. Harold Foster was waiting on the porch, his expression unreadable as they dismounted. Kirk helped Lillian down from her horse, then faced her father with the same straightforward manner he had shown the previous day. "Mr. Foster, I'd like permission to call on your daughter properly," he said without preamble, "to court her with honorable intentions." Harold studied the younger man for a long moment. "Seems to me you've already been courting her, taking her out to your property unchaperoned." Lillian stepped forward. "Pa, it wasn't like that. Kirk was just showing me the land, the house he's building." "A house for the two of you, I expect," Harold said, his tone softening slightly as he looked at his daughter's flushed face. "Yes, sir," Kirk admitted, "if Lillian will have me. But I want to do right by her, by you. No rushing, no secrets. Everything open and proper." Harold sighed, looking suddenly older, the weight of a father seeing his only daughter slipping away evident in the slump of his shoulders. "You heard her once, Gallagher." Left her waiting while half the eligible men in the territory came sniffing around. "Can't say I'm eager to see that happen again." "It won't, sir," Kirk promised, his voice steady. "I'm here to stay this time. Nothing could drag me away from Riverton from Lillian ever again." Harold looked to his daughter, silently questioning. Lillian met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I love him, Pa, always have." Another heavy sigh, then Harold nodded slowly. "All right, then. You have my permission to call on Lily, but you'll be respectful of her reputation, you hear. No more day-long excursions alone, and I expect to see progress on that house before any wedding takes place." Kirk's face split into a wide grin. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Harold harumphed, trying to maintain his stern demeanor despite the happiness radiating from the young couple. "Better come inside, both of you. Neighbors have been watching this whole exchange, might as well give them something real to gossip about." The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Kirk courted Lillian properly, calling at her father's house 3 evenings a week, escorting her to church on Sundays, and taking her for chaperoned outings around town. The people of Riverton watched with interest as the notorious cowboy who had abandoned Lillian Foster returned to claim her heart once more. Some, like Martha Wilson, who ran the boarding house, approved heartily. "Always knew he'd come back for her," she told anyone who would listen. Saw the way he looked at her before he left. That wasn't a man planning to stay away forever. Others, like James Thornton, the bank manager who had twice proposed to Lillian during Kirk's absence, were less enthusiastic. "Fellows probably after her father's land," he muttered to his cronies at the saloon. "Nothing but a drifter with a silver tongue." But as the weeks turned into months, even the skeptics began to soften. Kirk proved himself a man of his word, working from dawn till dusk on his house and land, coming into town covered in sawdust and paint, but with progress to report each time. He made a point of involving himself in community matters, volunteering to help repair the church roof after a spring storm, offering his skills as a horseman when the livery stable owner fell ill. By midsummer, as promised, the house was finished a sturdy, handsome structure with glass windows, proper doors, and a stone chimney that would withstand the fiercest Wyoming winter. Kirk had furnished it simply, but well, purchasing a bed and dresser from a craftsman in Cheyenne, a cook stove that Lillian had admired in the general store's catalog, and enough odds and ends to make it feel like a home waiting for its mistress. On a perfect July evening, with the sun setting behind the mountains in a blaze of golden light, Kirk took Lillian to see the completed house. Her father accompanied them this time, sitting in the back of the wagon as Kirk pointed out the improvements made since Lillian's last visit. The vegetable garden started on the south side, the barn raised with help from neighbors, the beginnings of what would someday be an orchard. Inside, Lillian marveled at the transformation. Polished wood floors gleamed in the last rays of sunlight streaming through curtained windows. The fireplace had been finished with a mantel carved from a single piece of pine. The kitchen boasted not only the catalog stove, but shelves stocked with dishes and cooking utensils. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Absolutely beautiful." Kirk watched her, barely containing his pride. "There's one more thing I want to show you." He led her to the larger of the two bedrooms, where a quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed, a quilt Lillian recognized immediately. "That's my mother's wedding quilt," she said in astonishment, turning to her father who had followed them. "How?" Harold shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his daughter's gaze. "Might have given it to Gallagher a few weeks back. Thought your mother would have wanted you to have it when you started your own home." Tears filled Lillian's eyes as she embraced her father, feeling the emotion he tried to hide in the way his arms tightened around her. "Thank you, Pa." When she pulled away, Harold cleared his throat gruffly. "Think I'll have a look at that barn," he said, making a hasty exit and leaving Lillian alone with Kirk. Kirk took her hands in his expression solemn despite the joy dancing in his storm-gray eyes. "This is all for you, Lily. Every nail, every board, every decision was made with you in mind." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Lillian's heart raced as Kirk opened the pouch, tipping its contents into his palm, a simple gold band topped with a small, perfect diamond that caught the evening light. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, "but it's honest, like what I feel for you." "It's perfect," Lillian whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Kirk took a deep breath, then slowly knelt before her, still holding her hand. "Lillian Foster, I've loved you for 3 long years, through separation and hardship and more miles than I care to count. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she nodded, unable to form words for a moment. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Kirk Gallagher, I will marry you." Kirk's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into an embrace that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't express. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made Lillian's heart ache with happiness. "When?" he asked against her lips, unwilling to release her completely. "Soon," she answered, equally reluctant to break their connection. "As soon as can be arranged." Kirk smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "How about the first day of autumn? That gives us 2 months to prepare, and we'll start our life together as the seasons change." "Perfect," Lillian agreed, knowing she would have married him that very night if possible. When they returned to the main room, Harold Foster was waiting, having completed his inspection of the barn with suspicious speed. One look at his daughter's radiant face and the ring glinting on her finger told him everything he needed to know. "Well?" he demanded of Kirk, though his gruff tone couldn't disguise the emotion beneath. Kirk straightened his shoulders, facing the older man directly. "Mr. Foster, your daughter has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." Harold nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less. "And when do you plan to make an honest woman of her?" "September 21st, sir, the first day of autumn." Harold considered this, then extended his hand to the younger man. "That'll do. Welcome to the family, Gallagher." Kirk's surprise at this sudden acceptance was evident as he shook his future father-in-law's hand. "Thank you, sir." "Call me Harold," the older man said gruffly. "Reckon we're past the sir business now." The 2 months leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Lillian divided her time between helping her father prepare for her departure and working on the finishing touches for her new home with Kirk. The women of Riverton rallied around her, organizing sewing circles to help with her trousseau, sharing recipes and household tips, treating her with the special deference reserved for brides-to-be. Kirk, meanwhile, continued improving the ranch, now with occasional help from Harold, who found himself increasingly drawn to the young man's vision for the land. Together, they built additional corrals, repaired fencing, and brought in the first small herd of cattle, 20 head of prime Hereford stock, that would form the foundation of the Gallagher Ranch. As summer waned, and the first hints of autumn touched the cottonwood leaves with gold, Lillian found herself standing once more at the edge of the Snake River, where her story with Kirk had begun anew just months before. She had come alone, needing a moment of quiet reflection before the whirlwind of wedding festivities began. The water flowed past, constant and unchanging despite the years that had altered everything else in her life. Lillian closed her eyes, remembering the lonely girl who had stood in this spot for 3 springs, waiting for a man who seemed as elusive as the wind. Now that same man was building a life with her, preparing to take her as his wife before God and the entire community of Riverton. "Thought I might find you here." Lillian turned at the familiar voice, smiling as Kirk approached. He looked different now than he had that first evening, more settled, less wary, his clothes those of a successful rancher rather than a drifting cowboy. "Needed some time to think," she explained as he came to stand beside her. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, his tone light though she detected a flicker of genuine concern. Lillian shook her head, reaching for his hand. "Never, just remembering." Kirk squeezed her fingers gently. "I used to dream about this spot, you know. When I was in some God-forsaken town in New Mexico or riding through the Texas Panhandle in the middle of a dust storm, I'd close my eyes and see you standing here, waiting. And here I was," she said softly, "right where you left me." Kirk turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "That's the last time I'll ever leave you, Lily. From now on, wherever I go, you go too. Promise?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I swear it," he replied, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted of promises kept and a future unfolding before them. 3 days later, on the first day of autumn, Lillian Foster became Lillian Gallagher in a ceremony that brought together the entire town of Riverton. The church was decorated with the last wildflowers of the season, their vibrant colors a reminder of the spring that had brought Kirk back to her. Lillian wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha Wilson had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had adorned her mother's wedding dress 30 years before. Kirk waited at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in a new black suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his gray eyes never leaving Lillian as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. When Harold placed his daughter's hand in Kirk's, the older man's eyes glistened with unshed tears, though he would later deny it vehemently to anyone who dared mention it. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt, the words of commitment spoken with voices steady and sure. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Kirk kissed his bride with a tenderness that made the women in the congregation sigh and the men shift uncomfortably, reminded of their own wedding days long past. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with tables set up outside the church under the golden leaves of cottonwood trees. There was music and dancing, food and drink, laughter and a few sentimental tears as the town celebrated not just a wedding but the fulfillment of a romance that had captured their collective imagination. As darkness fell, Kirk and Lillian slipped away from the festivities, climbing into the wagon that would take them to their new home. Harold Foster stood on the church steps, watching as his daughter embarked on her new life, a bittersweet smile on his weathered face. "Take care of her, Gallagher," he called as the wagon pulled away. Kirk raised a hand in acknowledgement. "With my life, Harold." The night was clear, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky as they traveled the now familiar road to the ranch. Lillian leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her in waves. "Happy, Mrs. Gallagher?" Kirk asked, his arm tight around her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, tilting her face up for a kiss that he gladly provided. When they arrived at the ranch, their home now, truly and completely, Kirk insisted on carrying Lillian across the threshold, a tradition she laughingly protested, until his arms swept her off her feet, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. Inside, the house welcomed them with the soft glow of lamps Kirk had asked a neighbor to light before they arrived. A fire burned low in the fireplace, taking the edge off the autumn chill that crept in after sunset. On the table stood a bottle of champagne, a wedding gift from Martha Wilson, who had insisted every bride deserved at least one glass of bubbly on her wedding night. Kirk set Lillian on her feet carefully, watching her as she moved through the rooms that were now hers as much as his. When she turned back to him, her eyes shining with happiness, he felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Welcome home, Lily," he said softly. She came to him then, stepping into the circle of his arms as naturally as if she had been doing it all her life. "Home," she echoed. "That's a beautiful word." "Not as beautiful as wife," Kirk murmured against her hair, "or forever." Lillian looked up at him, her heart so full it seemed impossible that her body could contain it. "I love you, Kirk Gallagher. Thank you for coming back to me." He brushed his lips against hers, a feather-light touch that promised more to come. "Thank you for waiting, Lillian Gallagher, for believing in me when no one else did." As the fire crackled and the autumn wind whispered around the eaves of their home, Kirk and Lillian began the first night of their life together, sealing with tender passion the promises they had made before God and man just hours before. Morning found them wrapped in each other's arms beneath the blue and green wedding quilt, the rising sun casting patterns through the curtains onto the wooden floor. Lillian woke first, watching the play of light across Kirk's sleeping face, memorizing every line and plane as if she might never see him again. As if sensing her scrutiny, Kirk's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with sleep for just a moment before focusing on her face. A slow smile spread across his features, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Morning, wife," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and something more, something that sent a shiver of delight through Lillian's body. "Morning, husband," she replied, savoring the word on her tongue. They spent that first day as man and wife, learning the rhythm of shared life, preparing meals together in the kitchen. Kirk had designed with Lillian in mind, tending to the animals that depended on them, walking the boundaries of their land hand in hand as Kirk pointed out his plans for the future. As the golden afternoon light began to fade, they sat on the porch, Lillian nestled against Kirk's side, watching as the shadows lengthened across their valley. "This time next year, I want to have doubled the herd," Kirk said, his arm secure around her shoulders. "Maybe started breeding horses too," Lillian smiled, placing a hand over his heart. "And what else might we have by this time next year?" Kirk looked down at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Are you saying?" "Not yet," she laughed, enjoying his momentary confusion, "but perhaps by then." "Would you like that? A son or daughter to inherit all we're building?" The expression that crossed Kirk's face was one Lillian knew she would remember until her dying day, a mixture of hope, joy, and something so tender it made her throat ache with emotion. "More than anything," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A little girl with your eyes and spirit, or a boy with your kindness and determination." "Not yours," she teased gently. Kirk shook his head, suddenly serious. "They'll have the best of you, Lily. That's what I hope for." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Kirk and Lillian Gallagher sat wrapped in each other's arms, dreaming of the future they would build together, a future that had begun with a promise made by a river and fulfilled through years of separation and steadfast love. In the spring of 1874, Lillian Gallagher stood once more at the edge of the Snake River, though not in the same spot where she had waited so faithfully for Kirk's return. This time, she stood on the section of the river that cut through their land, watching the water flow past, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. A lot had changed in the months since their wedding. The small herd of cattle had wintered well, with minimal losses despite the harsh Wyoming weather. The house had proven sturdy against the wind and snow, the fireplace Kirk had built with such care keeping them warm through even the coldest nights. Harold Foster had become a frequent visitor. His initial reservations about Kirk long since forgotten as he witnessed his son-in-law's dedication to both the land and Lillian. And there was one other change, one that Lillian had confirmed just a week ago with Martha Wilson, who had delivered half the babies in Riverton and knew the signs well. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, a smile spreading across her face as Kirk rode toward her, leading a string of 4 horses' new stock he had purchased from a breeder in Montana. The beginning of the horse breeding program he had spoken of since their first days together. He dismounted with fluid grace, securing the horses to a nearby tree before approaching his wife. Even now, after months of marriage, the sight of him made Lillian's heart beat faster. The winter had added new lines to his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth, the same devotion that had sustained her through their years apart. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Kirk said, gesturing to the horses. "The bay mares already in foal should deliver by midsummer." "They're magnificent," Lillian agreed, admiring the sleek, well-bred animals. "You've chosen well." Kirk slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her against his side. "How are you feeling today? Still sick in the mornings?" Lillian nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. She had told him of her suspicions 2 weeks ago, watching as his expression had transformed from confusion to wonder to a joy so pure it had brought tears to both their eyes. "Not as bad as yesterday," she assured him. "Martha says it should pass in a few more weeks." Kirk's hand moved to rest protectively over her still flat abdomen. "And everything else is normal. You and the baby are well." The concern in his voice made Lillian turn in his arms, rising on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "Everything is perfect. Martha says I'm as healthy as can be, and the baby should arrive around Thanksgiving." Relief washed over Kirk's features, followed by the now familiar look of amazement that appeared whenever they spoke of their child. "A Thanksgiving baby. Seems fitting, doesn't it?" "We have so much to be thankful for." "We do indeed," Lillian agreed, thinking of how far they had come from those lonely days by the river. "Speaking of which, I have something to show you." Taking his hand, she led him a short distance along the riverbank to where she had been working that morning. There, set back from the water's edge but with a clear view of the river, stood a small bench fashioned from a fallen cottonwood trunk, sanded smooth and positioned to catch the afternoon sun. "I thought we might sit here sometimes," Lillian explained, suddenly shy. "Watch the river together. And someday, tell our children the story of how their father returned to their mother after 3 long springs apart." Kirk stood silent for a long moment, his eyes suspiciously bright as he took in the simple bench and all it represented. Then he pulled Lillian into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I don't deserve you," he whispered roughly. "Never have." Lillian held him tightly, feeling the strong beat of his heart against her own. "You came back," she said simply. "That's all that matters." They sat together on the bench as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Kirk's arm around Lillian's shoulders, her head resting in the hollow between his neck and shoulder that seemed made just for her. "Do you ever regret it?" Kirk asked suddenly. "The waiting, the years we lost." Lillian considered the question, watching a pair of eagles soar high above the river. "No," she said finally. "Those years made us who we are now. They tested our love and proved it true. Without them, we might never have appreciated what we have now quite so deeply." Kirk pressed a kiss to her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "Wise as always, Mrs. Gallagher." "Not always," she laughed. "But in this, yes. Everything has its season, Kirk, even waiting." As they sat together, watching the river flow, past the same river where their story had begun, Lillian thought of all the springs to come, the children they would raise, the life they would build together on this land that had become their own. No more waiting by the river for a cowboy who might never return. Instead, they would watch the seasons change together, side by side, their love as constant as the water flowing toward the distant horizon. And each spring, when the wildflowers bloomed and the cottonwoods burst into leaf, They would remember the promise that had sustained them through their separation, a promise made by a young cowboy with storm-gray eyes, kept by a man who had returned to claim the woman who had waited faithfully for his return. "I love you, Lillian Gallagher," Kirk murmured, his voice blending with the timeless sound of the flowing river. "And I love you, Kirk Gallagher," she replied, her hand finding his, fingers intertwining as naturally as the roots of the cottonwoods that line the riverbank. "Always have. Always will." The sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their land, but neither moved to leave. They had waited too long to be together to rush away from this moment, this perfect, peaceful moment by the river that had witnessed both their separation and their reunion. The river flowed on, unchanging yet ever-changing, much like the love that had brought them together against all odds, a love that would sustain them through all the seasons yet to come.